In this lecture, what I'm going to attempt to do is try and take you through a very complex, very multifaceted series of developments from 1871 to 1900 in terms of developments in European diplomacy. This is a time of increasing tension, of a growing division between the powers of Europe, and so it is critically important in helping you understand why we end up at a period known as the Great War or the First World War. At the same time, it's really convoluted and a bit complex. So this is yet another lecture that I would advise heavily attending yourself to your reading as well as going through this lecture. I'm going to try and make it as simple as I can, but I recognize there's going to be a lot that's thrown at you. So take your time, try and go through this. I'll try and go through this as simply and concretely as I can, but give yourself a break and accept that this is going to be a little bit complex. So to begin with, in terms of talking about foreign policy, I've broken it down into three sort of broad categories: the Eastern question, the tension surrounding imperial conquest, and the growing alliance system within Europe, and how it's in some ways related to the previous two. Now, to begin with, our first topic is probably the easiest because we've talked about it for a fair bit. The Eastern question, the question of what to do with the Ottoman Empire. We've already talked about the Crimean War, the Russo-Turkish War, the Congress of Berlin. And what you should see in this is a constant tension for Europeans during this time leading into 1900 and thereafter. What are we supposed to do with this sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire? And one of the problems that Europeans are running into is all of them covet land within the Ottoman Empire and kind of want to get an excuse to get at it, but none of them really want the Ottoman Empire to implode entirely, precisely because of the fear that one of their competitors might gain more land. Additionally, the question is, what will we do to the balance of power if the sick man of Europe collapses? What are we in danger of losing? Will the balance be upset? Indeed, that's precisely why you had the Congress of Berlin, out of fear that too much Russian success would lead to too much power and too much of a collapse of Ottoman influence. So the Eastern question is going to linger. It's going to be a constant concern in the minds of European politicians. Now, if the Eastern question concerned, if you will, an old power and an old issue, the other area of growing diplomatic tension involved new powers and a new area of conflict. Now, we're going to cover imperialism in more detail later, but it's important to see how the expansion of Europe into Asia and Africa was causing diplomatic repercussions during this time period. If you will, like during the period we covered in terms of the 7 Years' War, the expansion of European powers overseas didn't mean that conflict lessened. It just meant that there were greater areas of tension and greater areas in which you could potentially lead to war. I'll give you two examples that showcase this. The first is the Russian expansion southwards in Central Asia. India had long been the crown jewel of the British Empire. It was its shining light, its most important colony, and that which it was most prone to protect. And the problem was, during this latter part of the 19th century, the Russians were expanding southward. And as far as the British were concerned, the closer they got to India, the more they posed an existential threat to the British Empire. And so while we think of Russia and Britain as being scattered powers, as ones who certainly couldn't come to conflict. I mean, think of the map, how separated Russia is from Great Britain. Certainly they wouldn't have increasing tensions during this time period, but in fact they do. The tensions over India and the encroachment of Russia in there will actually lead the British to invade Afghanistan 3 separate times in an attempt to control Afghanistan, which they failed to do, but also as a way of trying to prevent the Russians from taking control of that territory and thus having a position right on the border with India. So again, increasing tension begets more conflict. Another example of problems from imperial conquest and imperial expansion occurs in Africa, and it's known as the Fashada crisis. What functionally happened was in 1898, France sent an expedition to the Sudan, arriving at Fashada. And the goal of this was to extend French claims eastward along the continent of Africa. There were some who had a dream that the French could create an empire from the western part of Africa straight across the continent. The problem was the British had a predominant interest in Sudan as well, and when the French units arrived at Fashoda, they were also faced with British units there as well. And there was concern that this standoff between forces would lead to a conflagration. Indeed, there's some suggestion that had cooler heads not prevailed, it is likely we might have discussed a true First World War, but perhaps a First World War that occurred in 1898 and was one fought between the French and the British. But there was a strange benefit from this tension that nearly led to war until British and French statesmen were able to talk things out. It was as if staring into the abyss of a potential world war forced politicians to say, well, perhaps there has to be a better solution. And indeed, that's what happened with the British and French politicians at this time. In the aftermath of the Fashoda crisis, Britain and France, if you will, settled the old hatchet over colonial issues. The Entente Cordiale, which is signed in 1904, settled colonial issues between France and Great Britain and laid the groundwork for a new relationship between Britain and France to be built. Now, if Fashoda was driving old enemies closer to one another, a new variable in international politics was going to threaten the whole system. Functionally, a new Kaiser came to the throne, a new German leader, and that was Kaiser Wilhelm II. And Wilhelm II was convinced that the state of Germany deserved a place in the sun. He looked at his nation, which was strong economically, strong in terms of education, strong in terms of science, and believed that this nation that was so powerful, so strong, deserved an empire commensurate with its strength. William II engaged in a series of colonial power grabs, trying to acquire territory where he could. Germany was a latecomer to the imperial conquest, and so they had to sort of look for what was left by other powers. And what this did was create an undercurrent of tension where Wilhelm II, trying to acquire an empire of his own, was leading to tensions with Britain, leading to tensions with France, and generally making people see Germany as a potential troublemaker. And so you can see that there's growing pressures building off of some of the things we've talked about before, the Eastern question, the growth in empires, that's going to lead us towards a more solidified alliance system. Now, okay, wait a second. I recognize probably you're looking at all of those things and just going, that's a lot of text, what the heck's going on? I'm going to try and take you through it and help you see how all of this fits together. The importance of all of this is helping you see that the diplomacy and the tensions and the interconnections between all these issues is driving the states of Europe towards solidified blocks that are going to oppose each other. And that's going to be a critical building block or a critical prerequisite to what brings us about to the First World War. So how do we get there? Well, we've already covered issues with the Ottoman Empire. We've covered foreign issues. What are some of the issues that are pervading Europe? Well, the real issue in Europe is the problem of the Balkans. The problem of the fact that Austria-Hungary and Russia both have interests in the Balkans. Austria to expand and showcase its power, Russia to protect its Slavic brethren, and Germany sitting there trying to balance those powers between them. Initially, Bismarck tries to see if Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Germany can all sort of work together in forming a three emperors league, or a league of three emperors. This idea quickly flounders over the very issue that is going to cause continual tension, namely Austria-Hungary and Russia are in competition for influence and power within the Balkans. Bismarck's attempt was to try and preserve a status quo. If these three powers were working with one another or at least discussing issues, there was no chance for war to break out. The problem was it was unworkable. In the aftermath of the collapse of this league, Bismarck still attempted to keep the peace with Russia through something known as the Reinsurance Treaty. This treaty provided that each power would remain neutral if the other became involved in a war with a third great power. And so Bismarck in all of this is trying to play a careful balancing game between Austria-Hungary and Russia. This is a balancing game he's trying to play, but unfortunately for Bismarck, that new variable that we talked about before, namely a new Kaiser, enters the scene. Bismarck was certainly a powerful political figure, but he also was a powerful political figure that was, in some cases, quite annoying to deal with. Namely, he was convinced his way was right. He had a penchant for threatening to resign, believing that no government could last without him. And Kaiser Wilhelm II, sort of representing the passion and power of this new, strong German state, chafed under the belief that he had to listen to this old saw, this old aristocrat. And indeed, after, at one point, Bismarck threatens to resign, well, Kaiser Wilhelm II takes him up on his threat and dismisses him. And this is significant in terms of Kaiser Wilhelm II asserting control over German foreign policy, but for the purposes of the alliances, this is really important in that with the dismissal of Bismarck under Kaiser Wilhelm II, the reinsurance treaty is allowed to lapse. The careful balancing that Bismarck had tried to pull in Eastern Europe between Austria-Hungary and Russia was collapsing. And that's important because Russia, now not tied to Germany, starts looking around for, well, what power might be interested in me? And this leads to, in 1894, the formation of a Franco-Russian alliance. This alliance, a linkage of powers on both borders of Germany, was the goal of Bismarck to prevent. And as long as he had been in power, he had been trying to juggle the assorted powers, the assorted interests of Europe, in order to prevent Germany from ever having to face a situation where there were potential enemies on both borders. Unfortunately, with his dismissal and the actions of Kaiser Wilhelm II, that situation exactly occurred. Now, there was a potential that Germany could have tried to search around for new allies. Certainly, they were tied closely to Austria-Hungary, their ally, but certainly maybe they could have appealed to Britain. This might have been a counterbalance to any Russo-Frankish alliance. The problem was Kaiser Wilhelm II and his desire for empire. In addition to trying to claim colonies overseas, Kaiser Wilhelm II also believed that Germany deserved a strong navy to protect those colonies and showcase their power. And thus he committed Germany to a massive period of naval buildup in an attempt to build a strong navy, to threaten the British, to sort of open the British up to negotiations over greater and greater imperial possessions for Germany. Unfortunately, it had the opposite effect. The British, out of great fear for a new powerful navy bordering the North Sea, started to try and match the Germans ship for ship and exceed them, certainly. And this meant that there was an arms race, a naval race between Britain and Germany. Thus, this pursuit of empire was preventing Germany from reaching out to a potential new ally and instead making a divide greater and wider and deeper between these two powers. Now, all of this helps explain why the powers of Europe are being driven into different power blocks. In 1892, the Triple Alliance is formed, and this is an alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and built upon their shared interactions and heritage, Italy. So those three powers at the center of Europe. Eventually, though, the actions of Germany, the increasing tensions between Germany and Britain, would lead to the creation of an opposing alliance system known as the Triple Entente, made up of France, Russia, and Great Britain. And so what you should see in all of this is these growing, expanding pressures overseas, these diplomatic crises over all the globe, end up in a situation where Europe is being drawn into two big, powerful, opposing blocks of power, two blocks of states. And the problem is, all that you're going to need, as we'll see when we cover the outbreak of the First World War, is a spark to set all these powers against one another and lead to one of the largest and most devastating wars in world history.